person is there for a few days but then leaves and goes back out on the street. And one of the things that they recognized was because that person has developed almost an addiction to their ability to problem solve every day. On a daily basis, they're waking up, okay, how am I going to get my next meal? What am I going to do? And even though it's the overarching environment and situation might be miserable, they have grown addicted to that action. And so to take them out and place them in a stable environment is suddenly taking something away from them, and they had to start to reconsider how they do that, which is fascinating.
Absolutely, and that makes so much sense to me because that's synonymous with addiction.
Yeah.
You know, when you put them in, now you're in a safe environment. Here's your food. Just show up. There you can see the struggle with them because of those reasons.
Yeah. Suddenly it's I mean, for lack of a better term, it's boring.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and you see the reverse. Like we've also seen people who are released from prison and they're in a place where everybody's making all these decisions for them, and then they come into the real world and they're almost institutionalized because they don't know how to redevelop those skills to make all those decisions. Life's hitting them too hard, or they don't know how to handle it.
Yeah, they've hyper-developed certain attributes in these very constrained environments, whether it be drug addiction or homelessness or prison life. Because again, you think about those environments, they are very constrained. You have to. There's a certain set of conditions and rules you have to follow every single day so that you just survive.
Yeah.
Normal life is not like that. We're always oh, by the way, combat's like that too, and this is why a lot of guys come back and they have PTSD. When you're overseas in combat, you are hyper focused on this environment, and you're so hyper aware of everything that can kill you at any moment. And so when you leave that, coming back from deployment to the regular world, the U.S., where you don't have to worry about any of that, it's a shock to the system, and that's where some guys have trouble turning that down. And I talk about, I don't know, I can't remember if I talk about it in the book, but even me coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, I'm super vigilant. I'm almost hyper vigilant, and that can be a detriment because my brain is constantly on. And so coming back, now I'm in New York City, and I'm looking at hands, I'm looking at people, I'm thinking about the person who's 10 feet behind me, I'm looking at dark alleyways, and I have to almost deliberately say, okay, stop, don't worry about that, let it go, because your brain's just on overdrive.
That is probably the best explanation of PTSD that I think I've ever heard. I mean, obviously we all understand trauma, what you see, what you go through, all that kind of stuff, but this makes so much sense as far as just not being able to be in the moment and being stuck back there because you're trying to pay attention to all these things. That's just life. That's survival. You have to be that way.
And so PTSD, I would say there's two elements. There's the PTSD of not being able to turn down your vigilance. And then there's the even more nefarious, dangerous PTSD of those environmental cues triggering negative events that you've experienced before. Which is, I mean, to this day, if I smell burning, mostly burning anything, maybe not just like pure burning wood, but burning in the atmosphere or burning trash or something, I immediately go back to Iraq because that's what it smelled like. And so there's things that trigger those moments, especially, I mean, because again, we think about forging neural networks. When we learn something, there's a neural network that's forged, and that forging process takes place usually in a calm environment over some time, and then they get myelinated, and so those neural networks get really fast. So we can do them or we think them without thinking. There's not a lot of processing. One of the fastest ways to accelerate, learning, those neural network forging, are to have three factors: novelty, intensity, and focus. Right? When you have novelty, intensity, and focus, you are hyper accelerating those neural networks being forged. And so if we think about it, this is why when bad things happen, we remember them so much more viscerally, and we learn so much more viscerally than when good things happen. This is the difference between being told a stove is hot and touching a stove. Because if you're told a stove is hot, like, okay, maybe there's focus, but there's not that much intensity and there's not that much novelty. You touch a stove, suddenly there's focus, intensity of heat, and novelty is like, oh my God, that was hot, right? So that's why it's forged. These experiences forge. And so when we talk about these super visceral experiences, whether it be combat, drug addiction, homelessness, divorce, I mean, anything traumatic in our lives, we are basically setting conditions to forge these neural networks and these triggers so that they're myelinated, and then later on down the line, and we might think we've forgotten them, but then something happens that clicks in that takes us right back, and we're feeling those emotions again. And that's really the root of the problem in helping people with PTSD is how do you help them detach themselves from those triggers to the degree that they can now look back and reflect on it positively. Because if those triggers still exist, if they still get you into an emotional state, it's impossible, almost impossible, to reflect appropriately or objectively if you have the emotion tied to it. And so that's the hard work of our social workers and psychologists and all the people who are helping everybody with PTSD. And it's not just, as you know, PTSD comes in many forms. Drug addicts have it, combat veterans have it, firefighters, cops, even a nasty divorce. There's PTSD can happen with any trauma, and it has to be recognized.
And I love that because, I'm a huge fan of long-term treatment. And, back in the day, our program used to be 9 months long, and then it was 6 months. And, insurance just will not pay for somebody to be in treatment that long, unfortunately. So we've had to really modify things. But I was doing a lot of research, and it seemed like, and I want your opinion on this, 66 days of consistency creates a new habit. Do you feel like that 66 days creates that myelin effect that would help alleviate a lot of that PTSD and that trauma of doing like a good thing that many days in a row to sort of establish new habits and routines?
Well, I have to lean on Andrew Huberman again. When I talk to him about it, he will say that yes, it could be 66 days, it could be 33 days, it could be 15 days, it could be a moment. Right? Again, it all depends on this intensity, novelty, and focus. The more intense, the more novel, the more focus, the faster you're going to ingrain that. If you touch a stove and burn your hand, you won't touch a stove again. You won't go near a fire. You have learned that, and it's been extreme. And so I would say in a normal, calm conditions, normal life, hopefully we all have, the normal life environments, doing something over and over for, I've heard 21 days, I've heard 23 days, I've heard 30 days, 60 days. Doing something over and over will condition that, will myelinate that circuit. But it's going to be very subjective to the person. And the key is, I want people to be careful with this when I say this, but the more novel and intense and focused you can make it, the faster it'll forge.
Oh, I love that because we're always trying to push people into CrossFit for
Yes,
those reasons.
right.
You want to feel good fast. This is the solution.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, I'm going to do the yoga. And there's a ton of benefits to the breathing and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like the people that will give the CrossFit a try, they tend to make that connection a lot faster.
Yeah.
Because of those reasons, because of the extremeness.
Well, I would imagine you experience a lot of people who come to quit their addiction because of something they experienced. Maybe they had a friend who died and they watched it, right? And suddenly it's so visceral for them that something has to happen, something has to change. Those experiences also help. I know, people quit smoking because they watch their friend or their parent die of lung cancer. Like, I can't do this, Or their child will ask them something about, like, hey, are you going to die because you're... it's all really about how that affects our system. And again, it's just why the brain is so fascinating.
And do you feel like something has to occur for somebody to want change? Something?
Well, so I will say yes, but I'll qualify that by saying we can initiate that. We don't have to wait for something. We can actually exercise our brains in a way that helps us get to that intensity. One of the, and I'm sure you've heard this technique, but I think it's called the Scrooge technique, where you have someone who wants to change behavior, and you basically have them think about and sometimes write down what their lives will look like in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, if they continue the behavior they're on. And
we do it, play it forward.
Play
the tape
there
forward.
There you go. And see and really get a feel of how horrible that could be. And then you do it in the reverse. Okay, what will happen if you change your behavior and you play that forward? Those types of emotional cues, that could be the change. This is there's a term for this in terms of, I think it's counterintuitive thinking or something like that, where you imagine the worst case scenario. It hasn't happened, nor might it might not even happen. But if you imagine it, and you can do that forward or backward. So in other words, you can say, okay, this is the case where you may pass an accident, and you say to yourself, oh my gosh, if I had been 1 minute earlier, I would have been that car, right? It's almost the what if. And normally, in most scenarios, I don't encourage the whole what ifs because it's a lot. It's not if it's not done effectively, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time and mental energy. But you can actually use those what if questions very effectively if you use them deliberately to create those scenarios that help create change.
I love that.
Yeah.
I have an interesting question. So I was reading your bio, and being from the Bay Area, huge 49er fan. I was
Yeah.
very lucky at the Arete. There was Joe Montana there, and
Yeah.
it just made my day. What work did you do with them to help them, like utilizing this stuff?
Well, the work I did with them was actually not this stuff.
Okay.
I did work when I got out of the Navy. I'm friends with Simon Sinek, who's a Start With Why author, a really
Love it.
fun guy and great friend. And as I got out of the Navy, he introduced me to a guy named Bob Chapman, who runs a company out of St. Louis. Well, they're all over the nation, but it's a manufacturing company. But he basically came up years ago with this idea of truly human leadership and human-centered leadership. And so they had a leadership institute. I went to work with them, and I was doing work with them and doing Simon's work. And it was really that work that the 49ers came in, and I helped give them in terms of leading with a human-centric leadership, building trust, and things like that. And they were just such great people to work with. We went to Levi several times to give them some training. So it was cool to see the stadium and stuff. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about the attributes as much, or it was just starting to kind of get in my brain in terms of what I could write about when I did that work with them. So
How long would you say was the duration of when it started to get in your brain to publishing?
Yeah. Gosh. Okay. So how could I? I mean, honestly, I'd been thinking about it for years since 2010 when I was running that selection for that specialized command. What happened was, interestingly enough, I had put it aside. I had thought about it a little bit. I got out of the Navy. I met Andrew Huberman. We started doing some work together on grit and moving through fear, and we've developed some protocols. We'll release that down the road, but some great stuff.
Oh.
We had started talking about writing a book together, and in that process, we recognized he was on the path of writing a solo project. We couldn't do a book together unless I did a solo until he finished his solo project. So he was like, hey, you should write your own book. And what's funny is the agent we got, she said, hey, just give me some ideas on what you could write about. I had been thinking about high performing teams forever, so I gave her like 2 pages on a bunch of high performing team stuff. And she said, this is like 12 books. So if you were to pick one thing out of this, what would it be? And it was literally a one line, like one bullet point, attributes over skills. And I said, well, I could probably do something on attributes and skills because I had the stuff I'd worked with in the teams. And she said, okay, let's do that. And so as I thought about it, I said, okay, well, I can write about this distinction. Then I can just start writing about attributes and what they are and kind of go through these key attributes. So that was really the idea. And so that was about a year in development. And then when I started writing, the first 3 chapters were probably the longest, the hardest to do, just to lay it out because you have to introduce everything. Then I knew it was just about writing a chapter per attribute, and it went fairly quickly after that. I thought it was very fun. I mean, there were certainly times in any writer will say that you're looking at that blinking cursor on the blank page, and you're like, oh my God, what the hell am I going to say about accountability right now? So there was those times. But I mean, once you get rolling, and it helped me. Writing, I found, helped me dive even more deeply into my thinking on things, and that's why I like the process. So I love it. I will write another book. I have to get the attribute stuff, get the momentum going on that stuff. But yeah, I love the process.
That makes me very happy because that was the first question, because it's the end of the quarter. I got to come up with a new book, and everybody's first question is, does Rich have a second book? I was gosh, that would make it so easy if you did.
I have the idea, but I need to flush out the idea a little bit and then get the attributes business, up and running. That's taking a majority of the time, but I'm really fascinated with what I call elemental human performance. What are those things that cause us to behave the way we do, especially during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty? Because people say that it's only in the rawest moments that the real us shows up, right? Well, I'm like, okay, who is the real us? Who is that person? Because it has oftentimes little to do with beliefs and values and personalities, right? And those elemental factors start, obviously, attributes, there's a low. And the next thing I think I'm going to write about is identity. Those identities that we stack on ourselves that drive our behaviors in ways that we actually don't recognize. And that's fascinating to me. So that's that's the idea. I'll flush it out and let you know.
I love that because there again, I think because of how you wrote this book, you're going to have the science that backs that
Yeah.
up, which will make it make sense for me and the people that all love your book so much.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward
Yeah,
to that.
it's again. I mean, I was it hit me because I thought about how powerful a Navy SEAL identity is, how powerful a Marine identity is, leaving the service and suddenly that identity is not there anymore. And some people walk around, it's like, well, once a Marine, always a Marine, or the high school football team or that I played with, or the college I went to, I'm a Harley person, right? And suddenly I have all this stuff. It really keyed me in when I was watching this documentary on Flat Earth, the Flat Earth Society.
Oh.
And it's a really fascinating documentary called Behind the Curve. Now I don't want to presume, or anybody can believe whatever they want to believe. I happen to believe that that Earth is round, and I do so based on a lot of scientific evidence that is presented.
Yes.
In this show, they highlight and walk around with some members of the Flat Earth Society. You can see, and they do it very respectfully. You can kind of get a sense of their mentality and methodology. And during the show, they're on several occasions presented with very, very hard evidence, almost really incontrovertible, undebatable evidence, right?
Yeah.
And there are, and again, that's people can think about that what they want. But what I noticed when I watched the show is a couple times when presented with this stuff, you saw these people, you almost saw a flash of understanding, a flash of light, kind of like a recognition. But then they dropped back in. And what I recognized is that, what's happening here is these people, especially the ones they were profiling here, they've built their entire identity on this concept, right? And so to change their beliefs about it, they would literally have to throw away who they are.
Yeah.
And we as human beings, we do not like to do that. I mean, that is one of the most scary, challenging things human beings can do, is to take an identity we've built and a life around or whatever and put it aside. And so we do this. We stack identities throughout our lifetime. And the question is, how many identities have we stacked? Mm-hmm. And what rules what rules and conditions of those identities are guiding our behavior without us knowing it? And then can we, in fact, strip those down to kind of the core ones, the ones that are very, very powerful? Here's an example. For me, obviously I was a Navy SEAL, but my primary identity was always husband and father, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Navy SEAL. And I'm a true believer that we'll always serve first the identity that we prioritize first, right? So my behavior was always centered around husband, father. Now, the military does this all the time. They'll say, nope, we don't care about that. Now your identity is you have to serve this one first. But it's still interesting to see how different people behave if Navy SEAL is first, and then maybe family is second, and then whatever is second, or whatever you pick it, or Harley guy is first, and then something else. That's fascinating to me, and that's what I'd like to explore.
I love that, and hopefully you have solutions. I know I actually went through that. I told you, when the pandemic started, my son was in the latter of his senior year, and I have a daughter who came before him, and so for 24 years, all I knew is mom. Even though I worked the whole time, CEO, boss, team member, former drug addict, all that kind of stuff, but the thing I most identified with that I always wanted to be since I was a little girl, it was mom.
Yeah.
And so I was almost in an identity crisis. Not even when he left. It was that whole year prior, like leading up to it.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, who am I going to be if I'm not this?
Yeah.
Which is stupid because obviously I'm always going to be a mom, whether he lives with me or not.
Right. Yeah.
But I identified so much with it, I was almost grieving it before it even happened. And maybe that was good or bad because when he did finally leave, I was sort of like come to terms with it. I also started 75 Hard, so I started just distracting myself and finding out who I really was.
Yeah. Well, that is an example, a cool, pure example of how you can actually change the conditions around an identity very deliberately, right? And it's obvious that your conditions around that identity had to do with him living at home and you doing some mom stuff in that capacity. But yeah, any parent knows if you're a great parent, you're going to be a great parent whether they're living at home or whether they're with their own families, right? But the context, the rules around that are going to change, and so I think all of us who are great parents and love our kids, I mean, I don't even want to think about my kids leaving.
Yeah.
That's how bad it is for me. So I totally get it.
Yeah.
But I know that I have to, it's gonna change. And what I've tried to do is think about, really think about the best parts of every age, because every age comes with its own.
Yeah.
It comes with different ways to relate with your kids. And so now I'm really enjoying like talking. My 17-year-old is so smart. I mean, he talks like an adult. We can have adult conversations, and so I enjoy that. And I'll see as our relationship matures, it'll mature that way too. But that's a great example on your part of recognizing, coming to terms, changing it, and now you still have it. It's just now it means something a little different.
It's totally different. I mean, I even had to realize, like, what you don't want to do is stress your kids out and
Yes.
have them worrying about you.
Yes, that's right.
And so, when I would see them, I'm like, listen, I'm fine. I'm actually better than ever. And I wasn't even lying. I wasn't fronting. Like, putting all that time that I used to pour into my kids, into myself, you can't help but be a better person. And it really helped me with my self-discovery. And yeah, now, I mean, I'm lucky if I talk to him once a week, and it's not because we don't like each other. We actually love each other very much, but he's so busy being independent. I'm so busy doing my own thing. Yeah. It's actually a very healthy relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, parents and kids at whatever age, they can do whatever they want, but yeah, I mean, you have to. Our job, it's funny, our job as parents, our primary job as parents, is to develop human beings that eventually leave us successfully. If we don't do that, we've failed at our job. I mean, and so there's a kind of a hard irony to that, right? Because if we do our job correctly, then our kids, they leave the nest, they're successful, productive, happy human beings with high well-being, and they don't need us anymore. And it's tough, but but by the way, that's the leader's job too. So if you're out there and you're in charge of people and you want to be a leader, that's your job too, is to develop and empower your people in a way that they don't need you anymore. They outrun you.
Oh, and that was a very hard lesson for me to learn as a leader, because most 90% of my staff come through the program. So I know them from, I helped get you sober. Yeah. Now you're a wonderful staff. And then when they would want to move on, I was almost like hurt. There was this you're leaving your family, how could you kind of feeling? And it took me many years to sort of come to that, no, this is a good thing. Yeah. You picked them up, you put them on their feet, you gave them new life, you gave them some skills, honed their attributes, and now they're out there and they want to kick ass, and that is exactly what you need and want. And so I had to reframe that with myself as well as a leader. Yeah. Like, you did a good job.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that is what I told my JOs, the irony of leadership. If you do your job correctly, you eventually work yourself out of a job, because you have created you should be excited about that. I mean, I remember especially in the selection process, or when I was commanding officer, seeing these, especially the junior officers, coming up, and if I was in charge of selecting them, I'd be like, oh my gosh, this person is so much better than I ever was, and I get excited about them being a part and coming in and what they could do. That's really where you want to be, because that means you've detached your own ego from, or I shouldn't even say attached, because ego gets a bad rap. You've attached the what defines your ego, or you've redefined what defines your ego in terms of leadership. And really, what defines your ego is I've created a space and an environment where these people can thrive and eventually outrun me, and that's really a very healthy place to be, I think.
Yeah, and it's hard to come by, especially as a leader. You're trying to build an organization, you want everybody there, and then when they want to go, it's like, and you're right, in my infancy stages as a CEO and a leader, my ego didn't love that.
Yeah,
I looked at it as a bad thing, and I never wanted to leave my job. So why would I want these people to, want me out of a job? And so it is a fascinating process that you're not going to get that in a year or two. Most likely, most individuals, it is a process.
Yeah.
And working your way through it.
It's a highlight of the difference between being in charge and being a leader. Okay, anybody can be in charge, and being in charge is simply a position. That's all it is. Being a leader, however, is behavior. And so I think most of us, and it's just because of the way we grow up, right? Our teen years and our younger years are more selfish years. It's just natural. That's the way it's supposed to be.
Right.
And so in that maturing process, part of that selfishness is tied to position and kind of how you stand out and status and things like that. But again, mature and develop, you start to recognize, okay, wait a second, it's more than that. And I think that's a very healthy and normal maturation process, because, you know, I would not have been able to absorb this, or it would have been difficult for me to absorb what we're talking about when I was a young 22, 23-year-old, you know, ensign in the Navy. You know, it's just because you're a little bit more self-absorbed, which is fine.
I 100% believe that. Do you feel like this younger generation, the 22, 23, you know, I guess we're passing the millennials, but they're consistently, like, from our generation, like for me, I didn't go to college, I barely graduated high school, but I knew how to work. I had a very strong work ethic, stay in place, work your way up the ladder, you know, pay your dues, do the long hours, eventually you'll make it to the top. And that's exactly what happened with me. Whereas now it seems like there's, the grass is greener. Oh, they're going to pay me 50 cents more an hour. Oh, they're going to do this. And people are constantly looking for the quick fix, easy, let me go do that, as opposed to the old school, just work your way up kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm always optimistic of our youth, because again, if we
that's a good way.
If we thought about, I mean, they're the people in the 30s. If they saw us growing up, they're like, "What the hell is wrong with these kids?" Right?
Totally.
And as anytime you go back in time, it's going to be the same thing. And so I'm optimistic, because I think our youth, they are developing and growing in a world that we did not. And so it's hard for us to understand what that means for their development. And so I try to stay open-minded to the fact that their idea of hard work and their idea of success and all this stuff is going to look different than my idea, ultimately. And they are also, I kind of think about this too, just think about the mental acuity attributes for a second of our kids versus us. You know, they have been brought up in a world that is so fast. Their brains are developing at a much faster capacity than ours ever were. And that's only going to continue. And when I see, like, I see my sons, like we grew up, we remember Pong, right? And then it turned into Pac-Man and things like that. I mean, these arcade games, and now it's like these Call of Duty games, which again, you know, judgment aside, they are very intense, multi-dimensional games. And I remember my boys playing these first-person games. We'd be running around and doing stuff, and I'd sometimes sit and play with them, and like Halo, and they would kick my ass, and I went to combat, for God's sakes, right?
Happily they kick your ass.
They were noticing things. Their brains were just operating much faster. So I started thinking about this, and I actually did a little bit of side research because I was on my mind, and I did some research on one of the first people who ever drove one of the first automobiles. And one of the first automobiles, it only went about 3 miles an hour, and it was basically like levers or something. Even if the very first one was a steering wheel, I can't remember. Bottom line is the person who did it kept on crashing. They could not. The first time they could not keep the thing on the road. They couldn't steer it properly. And think about that. I mean, 3 to 5 miles an hour. And now we go on the highway. I mean, I was driving yesterday from SFO, and I mean, I was comfortable. And I was like, man, people are going fast. I mean, 75 miles an hour on roads that corner, right? I mean,
17.
Yeah. 17.
Oh yeah, I was actually going to warn you about 17. Like, have you driven that road yet?
Yeah, and at night. I mean, I was focused, but I was like. But just think about putting someone from that era into an automobile today, and they would be losing their minds, right? And that's a lot of how our brains are wired when the youth is jumping into this technology. Their brains are just developing to absorb more, or at least notice more, whatever it is. So that's the way I think about it, and I'm optimistic.
Well, you're 100% right. I mean, you know, I love to play video games with my kids. I'm like, oh, let's play Mario. You know, like there's two buttons and you jump. And you're right. When I try to play the other one, there's like 20 buttons and they're like navigating it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how do you guys do this?
Right.
You're right. So there is definitely, and I, you know, really do look at the positives of it, because I am also finding with the newer generation, they're more willing to be led. They're more, you know, they want to do the right thing, but they also have a lot of opportunities to do things, and maybe they're not willing to stick it out and be miserable in something they don't love. They're just cutting the cord a lot quicker, which is good for the group and them, as opposed to just, you know, going to work and being miserable every day, and it reflects on everyone around them, especially in my line of business. You got to kind of like want to do what you do. So that's a positive way of spinning, you know, them always looking at the grass greener. Maybe it's a good thing.
I mean, again, sometimes I think, okay, how was I at that age looking at the grass is always green? Maybe I was. It just wasn't as accessible as it is now.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get on my phone and do something with an app and have think something like, I mean, imagine, you think about it, we used to have to take pictures and wait for them to get developed. I mean, let alone
true.
now we can order something on Amazon and have it delivered by that afternoon.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to wait for weeks to get pictures developed. I mean, so just life was slower, and life was just getting faster and faster. And so I think it's just to be expected that demands and expectations get faster along with that. I just say I don't want to be a dinosaur, so I want to think about things and adapt and recognize where maybe some of those places where, okay, I'm probably not going to be able to dive into that fully, but I can understand it and develop a relationship with the youth and my kids in a way that allows them to educate me as I get older.
100%.
Yeah.
So then would you say, like our generation, like you said, we had to wait on everything.
Yeah.
We didn't have those quick hits ever. Everything was the long game. So it was the oxytocin for us. That's
Yeah.
very comfortable, very familiar. The newer generation, it's the dopamine. It's the bling,
Yeah.
it's the this, it's
Yeah.
the that. So what do you think that long-term psychologically does between the two of us? Or should
Yeah.
we work on really honing in on the other for each other?
I think it's an awareness more than anything else, because even us,
Yeah.
when growing up, we had telephones, okay? Rewind the clock 60 to 70 years, and when you wanted to communicate with someone who was long distance, you sent them a letter.
Right.
And then you had to wait for a letter to return. I mean, everything was slower. So I just try to when I think about how times have changed from when I was a kid, I just say, okay, wait a second. But when I think about when I was a kid, how times changed before I was a kid, it's the same. It's the same.
Yeah.
I think we're moving faster. There's a positivity to the fact that I think this type of environment is going to spawn faster solutions, faster technology, exponential things that is really exciting to kind of consider, because we're just doing that now. I mean, there's always going to be detriments, but I don't know. I think we could spend time. It's kind of like being in quarantine. You could spend time on the bad stuff, or you can just say, hey, how can we make this the most optimistic and the most beneficial?
Well, and I think that's where, I think us as a generation now, we got to put exercise in there. We got to
We
put
do,
self-care
yeah.
because we're not out there working in the farms and doing the physical labor and out in the sun. Like, we have to artificially
Yeah.
create that good health for ourselves in
Right.
order to be able to tackle and do all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And I would say, actually, as I thought about it, the one thing that I think we have to be careful of in this world is the speed of information, and most notably false, misleading information. Because we are in an age where information, I mean, an opinion on Twitter becomes facts after 1 million likes almost immediately, right? And so we have to, I think, if there's one thing we need to do is, as a society, figure out a better way to ensure that that reliable information is being promulgated and produced. That's a difficult problem right now. It really is.
It really is, and
Yeah.
it plays right into your book, which I